Hey guys, this is Chess Coach Andrew Rankin. Welcome back to Buffing Your Black Repertoire. Today I wanted to share a game I played on leechess.org. This was a 10-minute rapid game against a nice lady named Debbie from Nigeria. Her rating was 2197 and my rating was 2266. So I play a couple of games every day trying to get to 2300. I'm pretty sure I can get to 2400. I just need to do it. And after the game, I asked her if she wanted a piece of advice because there was a glaring mistake in this game. And when I saw a few of her other games, so I just watched her games afterwards, I noticed that she kept making the same fundamental mistake. And it was really interesting because when I said, "Would you like a tip?" after the game, she said, "No, thanks. I'm trying to improve my rapid rating." I thought that was very odd because if you're trying to improve your rapid rating and you just got quite heavily destroyed by someone, you would welcome a small piece of advice. And I said, "You sure? Because I think it would really be helpful." And she said, "No, thank you." So, for all my students out there and all you guys watching, this tip is for you because Debbie said no. So the game starts with e4, c6, the Caro-Kann defense, knight to f3, and d5. Now my opponent has the option of playing knight to c3, the two knights variation, e5 followed by a quick d4, which would be the advanced variation, or what she played, which is pawn takes pawn, and I take back with the pawn, and this is the exchange variation. So pawn takes pawn is a very simple way to play, and props to her. So far, so good. Now the c6 square is open. So after the move pawn to d4, of course I'm going to put my knight there. It's the most flexible move. So of course we're going to play that. Now my opponent plays pawn to c3, and I love to see this this defining the pawn structure so early. It really tells me that I know what my game plans are going to be going forward. I think leaving the pawn here and threatening c4 at any moment is a much better plan. Also, it allows the knight to come to c3 if that ends up being a strong move, such as knight takes d5 could be a threat, or even knight to b5. But okay, c3, no problem. And now I played the move queen to c7, and the idea is to put pressure on the c-file and to stop the bishop from coming to f4. So my opponent puts the bishop on e3, and I played bishop to g4, pinning the knight to the queen, developing a piece, and now I'm going to play e6 and develop the rest of my kingside pieces. So the knight comes to d2, e6, pawn to h3, which is a perfectly fine move, questioning the light square bishop, and I drop the bishop back to h5, and I'm probably going to come to g6 to contest this strong diagonal. Now my opponent plays bishop to d3. The computer says that's an inaccuracy, but I actually really like this move. And the reason is because after bishop d6, castles, knight to e7, I think my opponent should play the move. So my opponent here played queen to c2, which is just a mistake because I want to play bishop g6 and trade off the bishops anyway. I think here my opponent should have played rook to c1. And the reason is because after after castles, white has this really nasty move, bishop takes h7 check, king takes, and then knight to g5 check, winning the bishop and a pawn. So after rook to c1, before I can castle, I have to play a move like bishop to g6. But queen c2 just means that bishop to g6 comes with a little bit more power, because after I castle, I'm going to threaten knight to b4. For example, if my opponent didn't take, which she did, let's say she played a move like rook to e1, castles, and then something like knight to e1, knight to f1, I can play the knight to b4, and if the queen moves, then I'm simply winning a piece on d3, so the pawn takes. Now this pawn is super weak. Queen takes queen, bishop takes, and bishop takes. So my opponent's pawn structure is busted, and black now has the bishop pair. So this was what I was hoping for, but instead my opponent just took right away. Now I take with the knight, and I'm threatening knight into f4, which is a really nice square that targets the newly created weak light squares. My opponent now plays rook a to c1, and I decide to castle. Now comes the losing move, what I was gonna mention, And this is a fundamental misunderstanding of pawn structures. So this is the Carlsbad pawn structure, but most importantly is that her pawns are pointing at my king side, which means the rook should come to e1, the knight should go to f1, g3 should trade off this knight somehow, bring the queen over and attack me on my king side. That is exactly what the position is telling white to do, and instead my opponent pushes a pawn on the complete opposite side of the board. Not only is this a mistake because you're playing on the wrong side of the board, but it's also a mistake because it creates two more weaknesses. Now c3 is an incredibly vulnerable backward pawn, and c4 is now an outpost square. So if the move b5 comes, I'll put my knight on a5 and then jump into the outpost on c4. And when you have a blockaded knight in front of a backward pawn, it means that this pawn gets even weaker because you can build up all the pressure behind it and eventually unleash it. So I put the f rook on c8 with the intention of playing a5 and opening up my a rook sometime in the future, but ideally I don't want to play a5 if the move b5 is possible, because then my knight can't jump to a5. So we just improve our pieces, and now queen to b3. This move doesn't make a lot of sense because I think the knight wants to go to b3 so it can jump into c5, and that's why I keep these pawns flexible, because I might want to play the move b6 to kick a knight out of here. So I jump the knight into f4, and I'm threatening knight to e2 check, which is going to win a rook. So also if rook to e1, which guards the e2 square, then I have knight to d3, which forks the two rooks. So yeah, knight to f4 is a huge threat. So the bishop takes, and now I take back. And now my bishop is an incredibly strong piece, pinning the knight and putting pressure on the rook. So this 3-point bishop is holding down 6 points of material, so this bishop is now really strong. And my opponent pushes a4, and I decide to play queen to e7. So I want to set up rook to c7, rook to c8, and then knight takes b4, queen takes b4, queen takes b4, pawn takes, and then rook takes rook. So I want to take advantage of a future pin on the c3 pawn. My opponent plays rook to c2, rook to c7, continuing my plan. Now rook comes to e1, and I thought for a long time here because this pin looks very uncomfortable. Queen takes d5 is in the air, but I realized that my queen is defended by lots of pieces, so queen takes d5 would just lose a rook. So I continue with my plan, rook to c8, and now I'm threatening knight takes b4. For example, if rook to e2, which is a bad move, knight takes b4, queen takes b4, queen takes b4, pawn takes b4, and then rook takes rook, and black is plus 3 points, the exchange and a pawn. So this is what I was hoping for. That's why my opponent found the nice tactic and slid the rook over to b2. Now I don't enjoy this pin on my e-pawn, so I move the queen to d6. And my idea was that after g3 I might consider sacrificing the bishop for 2 pawns and a weak king, and I could also slide the bishop back to h6 and keep lots of pressure on this knight. Now my opponent plays another fundamental mistake, and that is pushing b5. Like I said, I was waiting for this move so I could play knight to a5 and then knight to c4. And now the pressure on the c pawn is going to be too much. So after knight a5, queen goes to b4. My queen is nice and defended by the bishop, so I can jump the knight into c4 immediately. Notice it was kind of hanging. And after knight takes knight, rook takes c4, queen takes queen, bishop takes. My opponent has 2 hanging pawns that you cannot protect at the same time. a5, and then rook takes c3. And now my rook is super active. So I want to pause the video here and have you guys evaluate the position. So I want you guys to look at the king safety of both sides, the material, the piece activity, the pawn structure, and the space. So take your time. So let's look at king safety. I think king safety is about the same. Both kings are quite safe. Eventually, black will probably make some luft, put pawns. Notice it's putting a pawn on a light square, which helps the dark square bishop. And both kings are safe, so nothing too different there. Material, black is plus 1 pawn, but also a material imbalance is that white has a knight, and black has a bishop. This bishop is doing a fantastic job controlling both sides of the board and key central squares, versus the knight is not really doing a whole lot on f3, so this bishop is much better than the knight. And piece activity. These rooks are incredibly strong, doubled up already and controlling the open c file. And these rooks are uncoordinated, and I'm not really sure what they're doing. We can also count the squares. So black controls 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 squares on our opponent's side of the board, whereas I guess we could even count these two. So 14 squares on our opponent's side of the board, whereas our opponent controls 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 13 squares for black, 5 squares for white. Black's pieces are incredibly active. Lastly, let's look at pawn structure. Black has this beautiful kingside pawn chain that goes right into the middle, and then 2 healthy pawns on the queen side. So 2 pawn islands, very solid. No pawn weaknesses. White, on the other hand, has 2 far forward, potentially weak pawns on the queen side, an isolated queen's pawn in the center, and a nice pawn structure on the king side. But this is 3 pawn islands, and therefore plus an isolated pawn, and therefore white's pawns are very weak. And lastly, space. We looked at the piece activity and the squares they control, so black has a lot more space versus white, and therefore the position here is actually -4.5. So even though black is +1 pawn, the evaluation says black is completely winning this game. And the game actually ends very fast. So a6, hoping to open some files. b6, saying absolutely not, we're playing where I want to play. Rook goes to d1. Not really sure what that does. It just makes this rook more passive, staring behind a pawn on d4. I guess he does realize that the rook's going to go to c4. Maybe this rook wants to come to c4 and put pressure on d4. But of course, we make some luft first. g6. When I look back at the evaluation, computer says g6 is the top engine move. I was like, this is awesome, because I took 4 seconds to make this move. And my idea is simple. I want to make luft, and I want to coordinate with my dark square bishop on the dark squares. So maybe something like this is a future plan. And my opponent actually, I guess, copies me. This happens a lot, actually, where you make a move and your opponent, for some reason, copies you. And after g3, however, the knight on f3 is hanging. So rook takes f3, king g2, and then rook c3, and my opponent resigned here. So hopefully you guys identified that understanding pawn structures and pawn play is huge. It will improve your chess so much if you can see these pawn structures without the pieces on the board and understand what they're telling you to do and what they're telling you not to do. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this. I thought it was a great game, and I wanted to share it with you guys. So just to let you know, black in this position had a 95% accuracy, 0 mistakes, 0 blunders, and 0 missed wins. I think 0 inaccuracies as well. Yeah. So a great game by black. A few mistakes by white, showing that white fundamentally doesn't understand really the position, and therefore the win basically just slips right into black's hands. So let me know what you guys think, and I'll catch you next time. Thanks. Bye.